Hey everybody, I'm Silas, and welcome to Psilocybology. Let's expand our mind. This is a series where we talk about the research on psilocybin, the psychedelic prodrug found in magic mushrooms. We'll be breaking down and discussing the scientific literature, one study at a time, from past to present. If you'd like to support the show, please make sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Today's episode is on the article titled The Effects of Psychotomimetic Drugs on Primary Suggestibility, published in 1965. Interestingly, the authors noted that this publication is actually a condensed version of the primary author's PhD dissertation, submitted to Stanford University. There's not a lot that we should bring back from the 60s, but I do think doctoral dissertations about psilocybin would be nice to see again. This was a really fascinating study, and it was also very well structured, with clear hypotheses that they referred back to throughout the paper. The topic of suggestibility, which has roots in the related topic of hypnosis, is one that comes with both controversy and hesitance. Let's start off the episode by talking about what suggestibility is, and what these specific researchers were testing. In this line of research, there are two main types of suggestibility, primary and secondary. Technically, it has also been proposed that there is a tertiary suggestibility, but the authors don't discuss it here, and it also doesn't seem to be as well defined. Primary suggestibility involves ideomotor responses. Ideomotor responses are when a thought or a mental image, an idea, produces a muscular or motor response. A really simple example of an ideomotor response that most people might be familiar with is if you ever shuddered or flinched after thinking about something frightening or unappealing, like maybe a spider or a snake, or maybe after thinking about some meal that gave you food poisoning. That quiver would be an example of an ideomotor response. Let's go through another example, but this time by discussing a test that was often actually used by researchers as an objective measure of primary suggestibility. This test was called body sway, and here's how it worked. Participants would stand up straight and put on a blindfold. The experimenter would then verbally suggest that the participant was falling forward by literally saying something to the effect of, "You're falling forward, you're falling forward now." The experimenter would then measure how much the participant actually did lean forward. One key thing to note is that although this test was often done after inducing hypnosis, it was also used just to test trait suggestibility without using hypnosis, to understand how suggestible a person might be in general. Also, as you can see from the example, primary suggestibility is not this idea that the experimenter, either by use of a drug or hypnosis or some other mind-altering procedure, can get the participant to start dancing around like a monkey, or that somehow they lose all control of motor function. These ideomotor phenomena are on a much smaller scale than that. Now you might be thinking, well, what's the point of that then? I think a key thing to realize is that these measures of primary suggestibility aren't the intended outcome, so to speak, in and of themselves. Rather, they are used as objective indicators that someone is in a state of heightened suggestibility or has a more suggestible personality. This would have implications, for example, in determining whether one can benefit from hypnotherapy. It's a proxy measure for an individual's hypnotizability. Turning our attention to secondary suggestibility, this is the type that I think most people think of first when you describe someone as being suggestible. Secondary suggestibility has been compared to gullibility, or the tendency to be easily persuaded that something is true. One example of a test used to measure secondary suggestibility is a variation of a Rorschach test, otherwise known as an inkblot test. Participants would be shown a series of inkblots, and then the experimenter would suggest what it looks like, and ask the participant if they agreed or not with their suggestion. In some cases, the suggestions were based on what a majority of people tend to report seeing, and in other cases, the suggestions are ones that would, quote, be rarely given and of poor quality. Participants were scored based on how many of the suggestive interpretations they accepted as being true. What's interesting about secondary suggestibility is that it's noted in the literature that while primary suggestibility predicts how able someone is to be hypnotized, secondary suggestibility doesn't appear to be a strong predictor of hypnotizability. Instead, it was thought that secondary suggestibility is much more predictive of an individual's need to conform to expectations. Since primary suggestibility is more closely linked to hypnotizability, it also became the primary outcome of interest in studies evaluating hypnosis and similar hypnotic-like states of consciousness. That is why primary suggestibility is the focus of the study, rather than secondary suggestibility. Before moving on, I also want to briefly define what it means to be in a trance-like state. Trance has been described generally as a half-conscious condition whereby an individual is less self-aware and less responsive to external stimuli, while simultaneously experiencing a focusing of inward attention and introspection. It's believed that this state is what produces the increase in suggestibility seen during hypnosis. In other words, some believe trance mediates the relation between hypnosis and hypersuggestibility. Now that we have that background, let's talk about the hypotheses put forward in this paper. The authors had two hypotheses they were testing. The first is that LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, and a combination of all three drugs will enhance primary suggestibility to a degree comparable to that produced by the induction of hypnosis. The second hypothesis is that these drugs will produce trance characteristics analogous to hypnosis, and that the degree to which these are produced will correlate positively with the enhancement of suggestibility. Essentially, these researchers believed that these drugs will produce a trance state that is similar to the trance induced by hypnosis, and this trance state will be what is responsible for the increase in primary suggestibility they expect to see after administration of these drugs. One unfortunate limitation in how I'm able to present this article is that although they note the names of the scales used to assess both suggestibility and trance, I wasn't able to find the original full scales themselves online. So I don't know what specific questions or tasks they asked participants, and I can't comment on their face validity. What was particularly frustrating is that for one of the scales, I actually found out there was a copy of it at the library 50 miles away from me. But by the time I found that out, I needed to record the episode, so unfortunately, we'll have to do without it for now. That said, I can at least share what the authors provided. For suggestibility, they used a 17-item Stanford Suggestibility scale. This scale was originally designed to detect changes in suggestibility resulting from an induction of hypnosis, and was developed in the late 50s and early 60s. This scale was comprised of three forms, Form A, B, and C, but the authors only administered A and B. Form C was surprisingly easy to find, but not A and B, sadly. Forms A and B contained a series of IDEO tests that measured primary suggestibility. The name scale sounds a bit misleading, because I think nowadays when you hear about a scale, you might think of a series of self-report questions where you respond on a scale from 1 to 5 or something. This is almost more a combination of examination tests mixed with a semi-structured interview. For trance, the researchers used the Trance Indicator Scale, which provided a, quote, composite score based on direct questioning of the subject about introspective experiences of a trance-like character. It also asked the experimenter to rate any trance-like behavior exhibited by the participant. What's cool about this type of scale is that it accounts for subjective observations made by the participant themselves, as well as someone else observing them. Similar to how some scales assessing a child's behavior or personality may ask both the child and the parent questions and then compare or aggregate their responses. Some examples the researchers provided as to what constituted a trance-like phenomena are intense feelings of detachment or dissociation from the immediate environment and from the self, feelings that actions and movements were being carried out as though asleep, and a reduction in memory recall, which in the case of this specific study was assessed by a participant's ability to tell the experimenter what some of the items were on the suggestibility scale they had just taken. Okay, so we've covered the measures. Let's talk about the study design. In total, there were 24 participants, notably all male and between the age of 21 and 40. These participants were reportedly volunteers and were paid an unspecified amount for their time. They were also reportedly in good physical and emotional health and did not have prior experience with, quote, psychotomimetic or addictive drugs, which I'll note is likely not actually accurate, since that would necessarily include alcohol, caffeine, nicotine, and a lot of other drugs. What I think the authors meant was that they had never used either psychedelic drugs or illegal narcotic drugs. 60 years later, people are still confused about what drugs are, but let's not get started with that today. This study was also a within-study design, meaning that all participants received each of the 4 drug conditions. The trials for a given participant were conducted 7 days apart so that any tolerance developed would dissipate. As we've discovered previously on this podcast, research prior to the study has indicated that tolerance and cross-tolerance to psychedelics appears to dissipate between 1 to 2 weeks after administration. The order of the drug trials was also randomized. There is one point I want to introduce here, though, that we'll revisit later. If you recall from the hypotheses, the authors hypothesized that our drugs of interest will enhance suggestibility and produce a trance that was, quote, to a degree comparable to that produced by the induction of hypnosis. In order to properly evaluate their claim, then, they included a trial where they induced hypnosis so they could compare results to the drug trials. Importantly, the hypnosis condition was always conducted last at the conclusion of the study, and was not randomized among the drug trials. They also conducted the hypnosis trial 1 month after the final drug trial. I think part of the rationale for this was that they didn't want participants to know the experiment was investigating the topic of hypnosis and suggestibility. The authors noted that 1 month after the final drug trial, quote, the subject was then invited to cooperate in an induction of hypnosis, to which they agreed. One advantage to using some level of deceit is that sometimes participants will respond differently depending on how much they know about the purpose of the study. My guess is that since hypnosis is a topic that produces a level of skepticism in many people, and since suggestibility is also a fairly stigmatized topic, with some people unfortunately linking being suggestible with having a lack of intelligence, the researchers thought they'd get more genuine responses if participants didn't know their true purpose. One consequence of this design, however, is that since hypnosis is always done last, there's the potential for there to be an order effect, which we'll revisit when we get to the results. There are 2 final notes about the methods before we move on. The researchers administered doses that they considered roughly equivalent between the drugs of interest. Specifically, they gave participants 1.5 micrograms of LSD per kilogram of body weight, 5 milligrams of mescaline per kilogram of body weight, and 0.225 milligrams of psilocybin per kilogram of body weight. That means that for a 70-kilogram individual, or someone weighing about 154 pounds, they would have received 105 micrograms of LSD, 350 milligrams of mescaline, and 15.75 milligrams of psilocybin. For the drug trial where they combined all 3, they did 1/3 the dose of each drug and administered it simultaneously. Finally, as for when they administered the Stanford Suggestibility Scale and the Trance Indicator Scale, these assessments were conducted immediately before drug administration or hypnosis, and again between 2 to 3 hours after drug administration or immediately after inducing hypnosis. To induce hypnosis, they used the, quote, eye closure method formulated by Weitzenhofer and Hilgard. So as a reminder, the first hypothesis was that LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, and a combination of all 3 drugs will enhance primary suggestibility to a degree comparable to that produced by the induction of hypnosis. Let's see if the results support this hypothesis. Analyzing the change in scores on the Stanford Suggestibility Scale, with higher scores indicating greater suggestibility, what the researchers found is that LSD, mescaline, the combined drug group, and hypnotism all produced a statistically significant increase in suggestibility. Psilocybin, however, did not produce any change in suggestibility. The researchers also determined that the level of increase seen after LSD, mescaline, and the combined drug group was statistically equivalent to the increase seen after inducing hypnosis. Based on this data, their first hypothesis was substantially supported for LSD, mescaline, and the combined drug group, but notably not for psilocybin. Now, this could in fact mean that psilocybin does not increase suggestibility, which ostensibly may distinguish itself from other psychedelics. One confounding factor, however, is that the duration of psilocybin is substantially shorter than that of both LSD and mescaline. Research has indicated that the peak intensity of a psilocybin trip, particularly among fasting subjects, which is often the case in many of these experiments, occurs around 1.5 hours post-administration, whereas with LSD it's roughly around 2.5 hours, and for mescaline it occurs even later than LSD. This means that since the assessments were carried out sometime between 2 to 3 hours post-administration, participants given psilocybin might have already started to descend from their trip, while those given LSD and mescaline, and the combined drug group, might be hitting or approaching their peak experience. I think to really solidify these findings, we would need to re-examine this test, but change when the assessment is given. Moving on to the second hypothesis. Again, as a refresher, the researchers hypothesized that these drugs, quote, will produce trance characteristics analogous to hypnosis, and that the degree to which these are produced will correlate positively with the enhancement of suggestibility. Although it's framed as a single hypothesis, there are really two parts to it. First, they hypothesized that our drugs of interest would produce a trance that is comparable to the trance seen after inducing hypnosis. Second, they then hypothesized that the scores on the trance indicator scale will be positively correlated with the change in suggestibility based on the Stanford Suggestibility scale. Let's start with the first part of the hypothesis. When looking at the change in score on the trance indicator scale, they found that all 4 drug conditions and the hypnosis produced statistically significant increases in scores. However, the degree to which it increased varied by condition. Mescaline, LSD, and hypnosis all produced statistically equivalent increases in scores on the trance indicator scale, and this increase was the largest increase seen. There was a slightly smaller increase produced by the combination of all 3 drugs, and then an even smaller increase was seen after administration of psilocybin. Examining the second half of the hypothesis, the researchers did in fact find that there was a positive correlation between the scores on the trance indicator scale and scores on the Stanford Suggestibility scale. Now this has of course the same limitation as the results from the first hypothesis, namely that the reduced change seen after psilocybin administration may be an artifact of the shorter duration of action of psilocybin. In addition, although this lends support to their hypothesis that trance mediates the link between a drug or hypnosis and suggestibility, this does not actually prove any level of causation, because as I'm sure you've all heard, correlation does not prove causation. It's possible, for example, that some other factor is producing both the trance-like state and the hypersuggestibility, which the authors do sort of comment on later on. The last bit of results I want to discuss actually goes back to the note I made earlier about a possible order effect. The researchers noted that while the baseline scores on the trance indicator scale, which was assessed before each drug of interest was administered, were equivalent across drug conditions, the scores immediately prior to inducing hypnosis were significantly lower than the pretest scores for the drug trials. They believe that since this was always the last trial administered, this reduction in score was a reflection of, quote, growing conservatism in reporting symptoms over the successive trials. It's possible this influenced the results, although I doubt it largely impacted the primary conclusion, since they did find that the increase in score was still comparable between hypnosis, LSD, and mescaline. So what do these results tell us? Putting to the side for now the results found for psilocybin in particular, The authors make the claim that some psychedelic drugs seem to increase suggestibility to a similar degree as hypnosis, and that this may be a result of inducing similar states of consciousness. According to the researchers, this, quote, may involve the fact of deep total immersion in a dramatically novel mental and emotional state. The authors go on to speculate that there may be another factor increasing suggestibility, namely a, quote, lack of desire to take the initiative in controlling one's own planning functions. Presumably, such a loss of initiative would increase amenability to the plans or suggestions delivered by an outside source, such as the experimenter. What's interesting about this idea is that we have in fact seen a reduction in task completion in both humans and animals after the administration of psychedelic drugs. Spiders build less webs, fish go into a state of stupor, humans complete fewer math problems and become more sedentary. If this idea were true, however, we would expect the response to psilocybin to be similar to the response after LSD and mescaline. This again may indicate the difference between drugs found in this study is really produced by the shorter duration of psilocybin. That said, the authors do put forward one additional possible explanation for the discrepancy they found. They state in their discussion that psilocybin produces relatively more pleasant or agreeable somatic reactions, so like nausea, dizziness, etc., compared to those produced by LSD and mescaline. Based on this assumption, the authors stated that, quote, there would be less need for a subject treated with psilocybin to reach out to the outer environment for relief from the inner turmoil, loss of control, and lack of ability to make plans, which would be more characteristic, according to the researchers, of LSD and mescaline. Now, personally, I like the concept behind this, but I actually think this speaks more to individual differences in how one responds to a given drug, rather than differences specific to the drugs themselves. What I mean is, I think for some people, the experience produced by psilocybin is less of a shock to the system, so to speak, than LSD. But I have also met others who find the experience produced by LSD to actually be much more manageable and pleasant than the experience produced by psilocybin. I think that for a given individual, whichever drug produces the most novel and almost uncomfortable experience, at least initially, would be the drug that increases suggestibility the most in that individual. This is all conjecture, to be clear. But personally, when I feel less in control of myself or my surroundings, I am much more likely to reach out to someone for guidance or support, and by extension would likely place more trust in whoever I reached out to. Anyway, the overall takeaway is that more research is needed, but I think going through this study was rather informative and at least got me thinking about some cool ideas. Hopefully you all enjoyed it as well. And with that, that's it for today's episode. As always, I really hope you enjoyed the show. If you have any questions, feedback, or ideas for the podcast, please let me know. You can find out all of the ways to reach me on the website, Psilocybology.org, where you can also find the full transcript for each episode if interested. Thank you all for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.